Mushoku Tensei is widely regarded as one of the best isekai anime of all time, and for good reason. Objectively speaking, it's a pretty solid anime, but people don't watch anime YouTubers for objectivity, do they? I've watched both seasons of Mushoku Tensei, and honestly, I'm really conflicted about it. While I can acknowledge all of the great things this series has, there are some pretty big faults that do still bother me. So in this video, I'll be giving an honest review of Mushoku Tensei and talking about all of my thoughts, good and bad. Also, just a heads up, I will be diving into spoilers for the first 2 seasons of the anime since that's all that's out as of time of recording, and I haven't read any of the manga or light novels. I'll go ahead and start with the pros, then into the cons, and loop back around at the end to talk about Rudeus specifically, who I think is a bit of both. As I alluded to at the beginning, Mushoku Tensei has a lot of good things going for it, so much so that it almost makes the show hard to criticize. When I first started this show, I expected a lot of the same fantasy isekai tropes that you usually get. Guy gets reincarnated, magically has the most OP abilities because he's the MC, gets all the ladies, and so on and so forth, but Mushoku Tensei really wasn't any of that. Yes, Rudeus did get reincarnated into this world, but he's starting his life completely over from scratch and has to learn how this world works. And while he did get to keep his memories, not all of them were super useful since this world is totally different. It gives you a deep sense of enjoyment and accomplishment as he learns all of these new magic abilities and you essentially grow alongside him. Speaking of which, the first major pro I want to focus on is how incredibly well designed the magic system is. It was simultaneously complex yet easy to understand, and I think that's due to us learning the magic system alongside Rudeus rather than just getting a massive exposition dump at the beginning. Things are introduced naturally and over time, which keeps you from getting overwhelmed and actually learning previous concepts before new ones are introduced, and the one doing that teaching is Roxy, who sets the bar and expectation of what magic can be in this world pretty early on. Now, Rudeus does have that special MC plot armor that lets him do chantless magic, but I'd honestly put him in the same category as Edward Elric. Both learned how to better use their respective magic systems through research, dedication, and practice. There are so many different types of spells. I think there's literally one for anything you can think of, but the rules are also clearly defined from the start. While magic is a very helpful tool that gets Rudeus out of a lot of situations, it can't do everything. So when he loses a hand in Season 2, there's still real consequences there since magic can't entirely fix that. Magic is treated almost like a force of nature, being able to be used like a tool, but also being dangerous enough to displace hundreds of thousands of people in an instant. In that same vein, I'm glad the series touches on the consequences of Rudeus and later Nanahoshi being magically dropped into the world. Both outside entities that otherwise weren't supposed to be there, especially in Nanahoshi's case. When the overpowered MC shows up and completely rocks the current power system with his OP abilities, there's seemingly no consequence or fallout for that. So while I don't personally know the full extent of what caused the Mana disaster, I am glad it was something that gets discussed because in these isekai shows, it's something that usually goes overlooked. Back to the magic system as a whole though, the author uses it in these really creative ways outside of just the usual things you'd expect. Like how Rudeus uses his prior knowledge to introduce this fantasy world to anime figures through earth magic. And while Rudeus is really good at using magic, he still finds himself getting absolutely rocked by people like Orsted, who casually just put a hole in his chest like it's no big deal. The power scaling is consistent and makes a lot of sense. If you run out of mana, you can easily be overpowered by someone with a melee weapon. So, like I said, magic isn't a perfect endless solution to any problem. Another aspect I want to focus on, which the magic system plays into, is how fleshed out the world building is in this series. We start out in Rudeus' small hometown, but are quickly shown how vast and expansive this world is, and the Mana disaster actually helps a lot with that. Being thrown all the way across the world and having to trek your way back really does a lot to flesh things out. There are so many different cultures and races on display, and some even with their own language that get special voice acting and subtitles. An extra mile that didn't have to be taken, but it does leagues to make the world feel real and sets this apart from other isekai. Even Ruijerd and the Superd having an entire backstory and false rumors associated with their race is something that didn't have to be done, but helps flesh out and develop the world building. I personally enjoyed getting a world showcase tour just so the author could flex on how expansive the world is, and I feel like we haven't even seen half of it. I mean, they do a lot, and I mean a lot, in Season 1, but Rudeus goes to even more places in Season 2 that all somehow feel different and unique while also being a cohesive part of this large world. There's also a decent amount of detail put into carefully crafting the world with things that make it feel more real, like how some continents are more or less prosperous based on their understanding and affinity for magic. Or the different religions people follow, I'd say the predominant one being based on Christian mythology, and how that affects their worldview. That being said, I never felt like anything was out of place, not even the homemade anime figures, since Mushoku Tensei does a really good job at balancing fantasy and realism. The magic system is complex enough that you can use it to explain a variety of things, like a robot that uses magic as its source of energy. I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention how absolutely gorgeous the animation is. All around, the show looks great, but things get especially good during fight scenes, and the choreography is handled really well, and paired with that incredible animation, it's just such a visual feast. One of my final pros that I'll talk about here is how expertly written a lot of the characters are, Rudeus especially, but I'll loop back around to him later. The characters feel very real, and their motivations are rooted in that realism. Eris is a spoiled brat who has no real-world experience or understanding of what goes on outside her home, so what do? Throw her into the real world and force her to overcome it. Richard is a nice guy at heart, but he carries the weight of that superb curse, so what better way to show how he truly is than putting 2 kids in his care and letting his actions speak for him. Even though he's changed and is trying to do better, he still struggles at getting along with certain people. I mean, the list goes on, and I am saving a lot for Rudeus since he is the main character. I like the depth each character has. No one is really one-dimensional, and clearly a lot of work was put in to make sure that wasn't the case. One mini arc I really enjoyed was Rudeus having to reconcile with his father Paul and later his sister Norn. In Paul's case, he was a broken man who'd lost everyone he cared about and presumed most of them were dead. He carries his own guilt for not being able to protect them while also doing everything he can to watch after Norn and find the rest of his family. You can visually see how his internal mental state has deteriorated without any words actually needing to be said, and after a brief spat with Rudeus, he can lighten up on himself and starts being more optimistic. Norn, on the other hand, gets a very poor first impression of her older brother, something that is carried into Season 2 as she studies at the Magic Academy. She suffers from the sometimes unbearable weight of expectations that Rudeus himself set, which doesn't help their relationship at all. But this is one situation where Rudeus's past memories are actually useful, since he knows exactly how she feels and is able to help her through that. Even Norn's initial rejection to Rudeus wanting to marry Roxy feels realistic and like a stand-in for the audience, given her own experience and feelings about polygamy. There's a lot more I could gush about, and I will once we get to Rudeus, but for now, time to move into the cons I have. As I was putting this script together, I realized that I really only have one major con with this series, and that's how overtly sexual it is. Usually I can glance over fan service and such, but it's so prevalent in this series, and it's such a part of the plot that I legitimately can't do that. I know anime is no stranger to fan service, and I've made my peace with that. For a show like Fire Force, I'd just give you a fair warning and say, hey, there's a bit of fan service in the show and you can easily look away until it's over, but with Mushoku Tensei, I can't do that as easily. I did not need a scene of Roxy sitting outside the bedroom listening to Rudeus's parents do it. That's just weird, and while the anime makes it out to be weird, it still just wasn't necessary. And there's a lot of other little stuff, like Rudeus just generally being a perv, albeit to a larger extreme than I've seen in any other anime, or him stealing a pair of Roxy's underwear and turning that into his whole religion. Like, he keeps it in a box and prays to it, and it's just weird, man. Any sense of chastity is completely lost on this series, with a few characters hooking up indiscriminately with no regard for the consequences. Not to say consequences never get brought up, because one of the biggest plot points is Rudeus slipping into depression after he and Eris sleep together, then she abandons him without a word. This is, as far as I'm aware, one of the only times that promiscuity has any kind of negative consequence. There's a similar instance with Paul, but I'll come back to that in a second. In the case of Rudeus and Eris, you spend the whole first season building up their relationship. You see them both start to grow and fall for each other, and Eris even implies that she wants to marry Rudeus, which eventually, of course, leads to them sleeping together at the end of the season. Only for her to realize after that they aren't a good match yet, and she up and leaves the next morning, leaving him utterly distraught for a pretty decent stretch of time. Not only was that a stab to the heart because he did truly care for her, but there was also that added intimate connection, so of course losing that immediately after and having no support system whatsoever would send him spiraling. The other example of promiscuity having consequences is after Paul has a brief affair with Lilia and gets her pregnant. This legitimately almost tears their family apart, and Zenith was upset for all of the right reasons. While it shouldn't have happened in the first place, Paul stepping up to care for both kids was the best thing he could have done. He needed to man up and accept the consequences of his actions rather than just kicking Lilia to the curb and calling it a day. Outside of those two instances, the rest of the series shows sex as this commodity that has no higher meaning other than self-pleasure, which is just something that I can't agree with. This is especially apparent with Alina Lise, who has a curse that forces her to continuously sleep with random men or she'll die. It's just weird because I don't feel like that needed to be in there at all. My biggest gripe, which looms over all of these others, is the presence of polygamy in this series, especially with Rudeus and how that's all handled. Now, before you jump into the comments and say, well, you like Demon Slayer and Tengen has a polyamorous relationship and you like that, I actually don't. It's the one aspect of Demon Slayer I've never truly liked, and you can say, well, it makes sense in the world. Yeah, I still don't like it. Polygamy is something that can never truly end well for anyone, no matter how great it looks on the outside. Humans just simply were not created to have multiple romantic partners. In Tengen's case, while I don't like it at all, it's a bit more palatable since it's already pre-established when we're introduced to his character, and either you like it or you don't, and we move on to the flashy fights. With Rudeus, we watch him go from single to married again, so on and so forth, and that's the part that frustrates me the most. After Eris leaves Rudeus, he goes through his depressive phase and eventually moves on once he's reunited with Sylphie. They get married and he fully commits to being with her and her alone because he himself says that he would never cheat on her. I understand that he's not a perfect person, but at the first sign of another attractive woman, he's back to his same old behavior despite being married. That being said, Roxy shouldn't have come on to him at all, and it didn't help that he was in a bad mental state after Paul's death, but even after that fact, he basically lets himself get talked into marrying Roxy because it worked out for Paul. Someone, by the way, he spent a majority of the series hating and saying he did not want to be like Paul. I know Roxy had feelings of her own that were taken into account, but sometimes that's just how life goes. Your ideal person is already taken because of circumstance, and that's not your cue to try and jump into his marriage as the third wheel. I do have a slight bit, just a slight bit of respect for him trying to be honest with Sylphie and apologize for breaking his vow. That is the correct thing to do in this situation, but the problem comes from it being under the guise of asking for Roxy to be his second wife. So it's not even like he was doing it to be genuine. I mean, he was genuine, but it was also with this ulterior motive of, hey, I want to bring this other person into our marriage. I think Norn's outburst at the whole idea was a way for the author to have an in-universe voice for the people like me who didn't like it. She raised very real concerns and reasons why it's wrong, and honestly, cooked Rudeus pretty good. Sylphie being okay with it too, on account of, well, that's just how Rudeus is, also just kinda sucks. When you get married, you're held to a higher standard, and these types of things don't get to happen and it be okay. You have to change as a person and get rid of those old habits. Overall, I'm just not the biggest fan of how this aspect of the series played out. It genuinely made me want to stop watching, but it was also the last episode of season 2, so I was pretty much done anyway. And I know that this plotline doesn't stop here, but I'll leave that there since it's technically an anime spoiler. Given that I've already briefly touched on and alluded to him in this video, let me talk about Rudeus for a bit. I would be lying if I said I didn't like Rudeus as a character. His story is very engaging and somewhat relatable for me personally. As an introverted person, I understand very well the feeling of wanting to just lock yourself away and never interact with anyone ever. I also really respect his drive and dedication to wanting to do better with this second chance at life he's been given, and I think that's something that a lot of people can relate to. He's by no means perfect, and that's one of the things I like about him. I'm someone who stumbles from time to time and does things I definitely shouldn't, so seeing Rudeus do the same and still be able to shake himself off and get back up is pretty inspiring. Something Rudeus and I also have in common is this innate fear of screwing things up and being a failure. He tends to overthink things and try to get it right, but when he doesn't, he just kind of shrinks back in defeat, and I can be the same way. I've literally let myself get decision paralysis just because I'm too worried of making the wrong decision and having to deal with that. Heck, I've even done it while writing this script and trying to find the right words for everything. When you've been given a second chance at life, you really don't want to mess things up because you may not get a third or fourth chance, so Rudeus acting this way makes a lot of sense. But as the series goes on, he does start to learn to live in the moment and not to overthink things so much, which is something I also am trying to do. I would also be lying if I didn't say Rudeus's morning runs made me want to start going on morning runs just to get in shape. I'd say Rudeus is my favorite isekai protagonist just because he's so relatable. I feel like he's mostly how I'd react if I got reincarnated to another world and had to start life over. Like I said, he's not perfect, but every time he stumbles, I want to root for him to get back up. Now, I still don't like his perverted side, and I think it's a little too egregious, but there's nothing I can really do about that. With all that being said, that's why I'm conflicted on Mushoku Tensei as a series. It's really hard for me to give a good faith recommendation of this series, especially as a Christian, because I can see all of the good things it brings to the table, like the world building, and I do think it is a really enjoyable show that can be really entertaining. I just wish all of the sexual content got toned back by like a lot. Will I keep watching when season 3 eventually comes out? I don't know. There's a lot of shows I say I'll never watch again, but then end up watching them anyway just to see how things play out. I think Mushoku Tensei will end up falling into the same category as Jujutsu Kaisen for me personally, a series I'm not too crazy invested in, but I might binge watch it once the whole season comes out. That being said, go down to the comments and let me know what you think of Mushoku Tensei, and if you agree with what I said or hard disagree and think I'm totally wrong. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more videos like this. I've got a lot of great stuff coming down the pipeline, so I hope you'll stick around for that. Until next time, peace out.